44 days. That's how long it took to destroy a life and crack the polished surface of an entire society. Her name was Junko Furuta, a 17-year-old Japanese high school student, diligent, quiet, always smiling. She dreamed of independence, of traveling, of a simple life. But in Japan of the late 1980s, some dreams could turn into traps. The story you're about to hear isn't that of a serial killer, nor that of a lone monster. It's the story of four ordinary teenagers who, in less than 2 months, lost every trace of their humanity. What you're about to discover is real, deeply disturbing. It is told here with restraint and respect for the victim and her loved ones. Not for shock, but to understand how the banality of evil can grow inside a living room, behind silent walls. Because this case isn't only about violence, it's about omerta, about social silence, about the accumulation of unspoken truths that end up suffocating reality itself. The silence of the neighbors, the silence of institutions, and sometimes the silence we keep within ourselves when truth feels more uncomfortable than lies. Beyond the facts, this story questions our humanity. How far can we look away before we become complicit? So how could an entire society let it happen? And what is it inside the human mind that drives some to cross the line of the irreparable? Welcome to Trigger Minds. Japan, November 1988. The city of Misato, in the vast suburbs of Tokyo, moves to the quiet rhythm of a nation at its peak of prosperity. The streets are spotless, families discreet, appearances immaculate. In this polished setting, Junko Furuta, 17, embodies the perfect image of Japanese youth. Polite, diligent, ambitious. She works part-time to save money for a trip. A modest dream after her exams. Nothing out of the ordinary. And that's precisely what makes her story so terrifying. One evening, as she's walking home from work, she crosses paths with 4 boys her age. Not criminals, not yet, but already drawn to small acts of delinquency and the thrill of domination. They approach her, lure her into a trap, then force her into a house. The house of one of them, where his parents believe they're simply hosting a friend. The door closes behind her. She will never leave again. What happened next can never be entirely told. For 44 days, Junko is held captive. The house becomes an invisible prison in the heart of an ordinary neighborhood. Days pass. Voices echo through the thin walls, but no one moves. In Japan at the end of the 1980s, people avoid interference. Neighbors take refuge in a politeness made of indifference. Parents look away, and society keeps turning, deaf to the horror unfolding just a few meters away. For her captors, it begins as a game, a way to test their limits, to feel powerful. But soon the game mutates into something else. Day after day, cruelty settles in, more confident, more deliberate. Each silence around them reinforces their sense of invincibility. Junko becomes a collective secret, a shadow whose name no one dares to speak. Inside the house, time dissolves. Days merge, nights repeat. The horror becomes systematic, almost procedural. She is no longer seen as a girl, but as a presence denied, an erased existence in a world obsessed with appearances and conformity. Outside, her parents report her missing. The police lose interest, assuming it's a runaway. Her parents live the waiting as a slow torture. Every ring of the phone, every step in the hallway rekindles hope. They print posters, contact local papers, plead with the authorities, but their efforts collide with bureaucratic indifference. They're told again and again that Junko must have left voluntarily, but they know it isn't true. And that's where their cruelest nightmare begins. The feeling that their daughter hasn't only vanished, but that even the right to search for her has been taken away. The case sparks no outrage. In a society as tightly controlled as Japan's, a missing teenager is nothing more than a footnote, a line in the police reports. Inertia becomes her shroud long before death arrives. 44 days later, everything stops. One night in January 1989, in a fit of rage, one of the boys attacks her again. And this time, her body cannot endure. Panic takes over. They try to erase every trace. They seal her body inside a metal drum, fill it with concrete, and abandon it in an industrial area of Koto. When police find the drum, they don't understand right away. It takes hours before they realize what it holds. Shock comes first, then disbelief, and finally anger. The 4 boys are arrested. They confess, but their age, all minors, spares them from life sentences. The verdicts fall, long yet woefully lenient. The country is outraged. Japan faces a chilling paradox. How could sons of ordinary families, products of a system praised for its discipline and virtue, descend into such barbarity? Beyond the crime, the entire nation is forced to look in the mirror. A society where shame weighs more than truth, where appearance takes precedence over compassion, and in this polished order, silence kills more surely than any weapon, because maybe the real question isn't what they did, but why no one did anything. When investigators discovered the faces of the 4 teenagers, the entire nation of Japan held its breath. They weren't outcasts. They weren't madmen, just ordinary boys, 17, 18 years old. Smiling in their school photos, sons of ordinary families, the kind you pass in a high school hallway without ever noticing. So how could such ordinary teenagers have turned into executioners? That's where the real vertigo begins. A question that would haunt an entire country. First, there is the group, that invisible entity that devours conscience and erases boundaries. Inside that house, they were no longer 4 individuals. They became a single organism, driven by a dark energy, the thrill of power. What shocks when you're alone becomes ordinary when shared. What disgusts one day becomes acceptable the next. Each looked into the other's eyes and found there the justification for his own actions, as if cruelty needed witnesses to exist. Among them, one stood out. More charismatic, more violent, he became the center around which the others revolved. Not an official authority, but a psychological one. He set the tone, imposed the rhythm, validated the cruelty. The others followed, sometimes out of fear, sometimes simply to avoid being excluded from the circle. In this dynamic, loyalty became indistinguishable from submission, and little by little, individual conscience faded behind the reflex to obey. Then came desensitization. Repetition kills morality. What at first provokes disgust becomes a reflex, almost a routine. Empathy fades away. They grow used to the fear in her eyes, to the heavy silence of the house, to the muffled sound of a life being erased. Suffering becomes part of the scenery, a background noise that no one hears anymore. And that is where inhumanity is born. Not in rage, but in habit, in that slow erosion of empathy. One of them would later say, "I didn't think she would die," as if death were just an accident, the final point of a game they no longer controlled. But in reality, they never wanted to stop, because evil sometimes gives the illusion of control. And around them, no one held up the mirror of their monstrosity. Not their parents, not their neighbors, not a society obsessed with success and appearances. The silence of others became their permission to continue. To them, Junko was no longer a girl. She had become a symbol, an outlet for their frustration, a territory where they could pour out their impotence. In a world where they controlled nothing, they took possession of the only thing they could dominate: another life. This gradual slide, this loss of bearings, psychologist Philip Zimbardo called it the Lucifer effect. The moment when ordinary people, placed in an extreme context, slip into cruelty without realizing it. Not because they are evil, but because they stop thinking for themselves. In his Stanford experiment, students turned into guards, and in just a few days, they forgot they were playing a role. Power replaced conscience, exactly as it did here. Inside that house, the line between victim and executioners dissolved within the logic of the group. Empathy disappeared. Domination became ritual. Junko Furuta was no longer Junko Furuta. She was the mirror of their inner emptiness, a twisted way to feel alive. Teenagers searching for identity, who found in cruelty a form of recognition. But behind this crime lies something greater. Because for 4 young men to sink so deep, there must also exist an environment that sees nothing and wants to see nothing. Japan did not only produce the executioners, it produced the silence that made them possible. This is not a story of monsters, it is a story of blindness. That of a country where conformity sometimes outweighs compassion, where obedience, when it becomes absolute, also becomes a form of violence. And in this collective muteness, each day, Junko faded a little more until she was nothing but a memory of what humanity should have protected. But beyond those 4 faces, it was an entire system reflected in that mirror. To understand this case is to accept a disturbing truth. Evil never appears out of nowhere. It builds slowly, step by step, in the cracks of everyday life, in the glances we turn away from, in the gestures we never dare to make, and in the words that remain unspoken. The Junko Furuta case is not only the story of a victim, it is the X-ray of an entire ecosystem. A youth losing its bearings, a rigid and unforgiving education system, institutions paralyzed by the fear of scandal, and a society obsessed with appearances and reputation. Japan in the late 1980s lived under the cult of perfection. Every failure was a shame, every difference a flaw. In this polished, immaculately ordered world, the individual faded behind the collective. This constant demand for order and success created an invisible tension, that of a generation that no longer knew how to exist, that no longer knew how to express itself. For some, violence became a language, a way to take back control, to feel that they mattered in a system that made them invisible and voiceless. These are not excuses, but they form a chilling observation. When empathy disappears, an entire society becomes numb, unable to feel the suffering it lets happen. Psychologically, this case illustrates 3 fundamental mechanisms. Conformity first. Human beings seek the approval of the group, even at the expense of their own morality. Ash's experiment proved it. We would rather be wrong with others than right alone. Inside that house, no one wanted to be the one to say stop. The fear of being rejected outweighed the voice of conscience and reason. Then comes the diffusion of responsibility. Milgram's experiment showed that many obey authority even when it drives them to cruelty or contradiction. Here, that authority was the group itself, a closed, suffocating circle where fear and complicity fed each other endlessly. No one was the sole culprit, but each shared a part of the guilt. Finally, desensitization. The more violence repeats, the more ordinary it becomes. The brain adjusts, reshapes itself, and slowly stops recognizing pain for what it is. What horrifies one day becomes reflex the next. It is the mechanism that turns pain into habit and habit into indifference. This trio, conformity, diffusion of responsibility, desensitization, forms the machinery of collective evil, an engine where no one feels responsible, yet everyone participates, consciously or not. And at the scale of an entire society, that mechanism can turn into a culture of inertia, where silence becomes a habit and habit becomes protection. Around that house there were signs, cries, whispers, rumors, subtle allusions. Adults who knew, but preferred to believe it wasn't their business. That is where this tragedy becomes universal, because this logic of blindness does not belong only to Japan. It crosses borders. It exists wherever the fear of judgment or conflict stops us from acting. Decades later, the Junko Furuta case still haunts Japan. It is studied in criminology schools, analyzed in documentaries and essays, mentioned whenever a new crime involves teenagers, because beyond the horror, it revealed something timeless and deeply human: the fragility of our moral compass when the collective remains silent. And the mirror it held up to the 1980s still reflects, today, our own contemporary silences and compromises. Indifference is not neutral. It validates. It legitimizes. It becomes the background noise of tragedies we could have prevented. And that is the human paradox. We think distance protects us, when in truth, it is what allows the worst to thrive and spread. Evil does not triumph only through the cruelty of some, but through the passivity of others. Behind the walls of that house, it was an entire society that went silent. Not out of malice, out of fear, out of conformity, out of inertia. Because to speak in that context was to risk standing against the current, to risk being noticed. And that fear of disturbing the apparent peace cost the life of a young girl who no longer had a voice. This analysis is not meant to condemn, but to understand what, within human nature, can make us slip into passivity or cruelty. Because in the end, this case speaks to all of us, of those moments when we look away, when we hear without listening, when we understand without acting. The Lucifer effect is not reserved for criminals. It is a universal flaw, a dark potential that hides within every society and within every individual. Sometimes it takes only a single abstention, a single act of denial, a simple, "it's not my problem," for a tragedy to begin. And if the story of Junko Furuta still haunts Japan, it is because it does not belong to Japan alone. It reminds us that evil does not need a monster to exist. Sometimes all it takes is silence and four walls. Junko Furuta was not a heroine. She was not a symbol. She was an ordinary girl, caught in the gears of a society that chose to look away. Her story crosses borders, cultures, and generations. Because what it reveals does not belong to Japan alone. It speaks about all of us, about our ability to see evil, to understand it, and sometimes to let it exist, simply out of fear of disturbing the peace. Every society likes to think of itself as civilized, but humanity is not measured by the wealth of a nation, by its technology, or by its traditions. It is measured by the place we give to compassion, by what we do when someone suffers, by the value we give to a single life, even when it doesn't look like our own. Junko spent her final days in complete isolation. That silence must continue to haunt us, not as a morbid legend, but as a reminder that evil does not always impose itself through force. Sometimes it takes root in indifference, in the gestures we never made, in the words we never spoke. The Junko Furuta case is not just a crime story. It was a descent into the depths of the human mind, a mirror held up to each of us. That's the DNA of Trigger Minds. See you soon for another case.